Hi, Joanne here from Relax for a While, offering you a soft place to land at the end of the day for your relaxation and sleep. Thank you for joining me as I welcome you to tonight's bedtime story. I will be reading for you the 3 classic fairy tales of Snow White, Rapunzel, and Sleeping Beauty, uniquely presented in a story within a story fashion, and I hope you enjoy. Now, settle into your sleep space. Whatever has happened today, or whatever is on your mind, it's time to let it go. Take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, close your eyes and begin to relax. It was a gloomy, rainy afternoon. The rain had been pouring all morning, but inside the cottage, it was very warm and cozy. Peter and Judy were very happy because their beloved grandmother had come to stay with them for a few days. Their grandmother had made plans to take them out for a picnic, but the gloomy weather and the pouring rain had spoiled their plan. The children were very sad as they stood by their window, watching the raindrops pitter-patter on the window pane. Their hearts were as dull as the weather outside. Their grandmother felt sorry for them and decided to do something to cheer them up. She was a sweet, gentle lady and thought the world of her 2 grandchildren. She could not bear to see them looking so disappointed, and so she decided to surprise them with a treat to cheer them up. Pretty soon, she entered the room with a tray of fresh-baked cookies and 2 glasses of milk. "Anyone hungry for some chocolate chip cookies and milk?" the dear old woman called out happily to the children. The fresh aroma of their favorite cookies brought smiles on their faces. "Yay! Chocolate chip cookies!" they cried. This was a nice surprise for the children, and they quickly sat down to enjoy the delicious treat. In the meantime, Grandma got busy at lighting the fire in the living room. She planned to read them a story by the fireside so that they would fall asleep for a short nap. The children finished the cookies and milk and felt much happier than before. "Now, how about a story?" asked Grandmother, with a twinkle in her eye. "Yes, story. Tell us about Cinderella, Grandma," said Judy. "No, that's boring," said Peter. "We've heard that so often. I want a new story." "Now don't you 2 squabble. I'm going to tell you a brand new story which you both will like. Come along now," said she, as she hustled the children into the living room where a cheery fire was blazing. The 2 children were all excited to hear the new story and snuggled up to their grandmother on the sofa, feeling safe, warm, and cozy. With the sound of the rain and the crackling sound of the fire in the background, Grandma opened the storybook and began to read the beautiful story of Snow White. There was once a queen who had no children, and it grieved her sorely. One winter's afternoon, she was sitting by the window sewing when she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell on the snow. Then she thought to herself, "Ah, what I would give to have a daughter with skin as white as snow and cheeks as red as blood. After a while, a little daughter came to her with skin as white as snow and cheeks as red as blood, so they called her Snow White. But before Snow White had grown up, her mother, the queen, died, and her father married again, a most beautiful princess who was very vain of her beauty and jealous of all women who might be thought as beautiful as she was. And every morning she used to stand by her mirror and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror always replied, "Queen, queen, on thy throne, the greatest beauty is thine own." But Snow White grew fairer and fairer every year, till at last one day, when the queen in the morning spoke to her mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" "Queen, queen, on thy throne, Snow White's the fairest, thou must own." Then the queen grew terribly jealous of Snow White, and thought how she could get rid of her, till at last she went to a hunter and engaged him for a large sum of money to take Snow White out into the forest and there kill her and bring back her heart. But when the hunter had taken Snow White out into the forest and thought to kill her, she was so beautiful that his heart failed him, and he let her go, telling her she must not, for his sake and for her own, return to the king's palace. Then he killed a deer and took back the heart to the queen, telling her that it was the heart of Snow White. Snow White wandered on till she got through the forest and came to a mountain hut and knocked at the door, but she got no reply. She was so tired that she lifted up the latch and walked in. And there she saw 3 little beds and 3 little chairs and 3 little cupboards, all ready for use. And she went up to the first bed and lay down upon it, but it was so hard that she couldn't rest. And then she went up to the second bed and lay down upon that, but that was so soft that she got too hot and couldn't go to sleep. So she tried the third bed, but that was neither too hard nor too soft, but suited her exactly, and she fell asleep there. In the evening, the owners of the hut, who were 3 little dwarfs who earned their living by digging coal in the hills, came back to their home. And when they came in, after they had washed themselves, they went to their beds, and the first of them said, "Somebody has been sleeping in my bed." And then the second one said, "And somebody's been sleeping in my bed." And the third one called out in a shrill voice, for he was so excited, "Somebody is sleeping in my bed. Just look how beautiful she is." So they waited till she woke up and asked her how she had come there, and she told them all that the hunter had said to her about the queen wanting to slay her. Then the dwarfs asked her if she would be willing to stop with them and keep house for them, and she said that she would be delighted. Next morning, the queen went up as usual to her mirror and called out, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror answered as usual, "Queen, queen, on thy throne, Snow White's the fairest thou must own." And the queen knew that Snow White had not been slain, so she sent for the hunter and made him confess that he had let Snow White go. And she made him search about beyond the forest, till at last he brought back word to her that Snow White was dwelling in a little hut on the hill with some coal miners. Then the queen dressed herself up like an old woman, and, taking a poisoned comb with her, went back the next day to the hut where Snow White was living. Now the dwarfs had warned her not to open the door to anybody, lest evil might befall her, and she found it very lonesome keeping always within doors. When the queen, disguised as an old woman, came to the door of the house, she knocked upon it with her stick, but Snow White called out from within, "Who is there? Go away. I must not let anybody come in." "All right," answered the queen. "If you can come to the window, we can have a little chat there, and I can show you my wares." So when Snow White came to the window, the queen said, "Oh, what beautiful black hair! You ought to have a comb to bind it up." And she showed her the comb that she had brought with her. But Snow White said, "I have no money and cannot afford to buy so fine a comb." Then the queen said, "That is no matter. Perhaps you have something golden that you can give me in exchange?" And Snow White thought of a golden ring that her father had given her and offered to give it for the comb. The queen took it and gave Snow White the comb and bade her goodbye and went back to the palace. Snow White lost no time in going to the mirror and binding up her hair and putting the comb into it, but it had scarcely been in her hair a few minutes when she fell down as if she were dead. All the blood left her cheeks, and she was Snow White indeed. When the dwarfs came home that evening, they were surprised to find that the table was not spread for them, and looking about, they soon found Snow White lying upon the ground as if she were dead. But one of them listened to her heart and said, "She lives, she lives." And they began to consider what caused Snow White to fall into such a swoon. They soon found the comb, and when they took it out, Snow White soon opened her eyes and became as lively as she ever was before. Next morning the queen went to the mirror on the wall and said to it, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror said as before, "Queen, queen, on thy throne, Snow White's the fairest thou must own." Then the queen knew that something had happened to the comb and that Snow White was still alive. So she dressed herself once more as an old woman and took with her a poisoned ribbon and went to the hut of the three dwarfs. And when she got there, she knocked at the door, but Snow White called out, "You cannot enter. I must not open the door." Then, as before, the queen called out in reply, "Then come to the window, and you can see my wares." When Snow White came to the window, the queen said, "You are looking more beautiful than ever, but how unbecomingly you arrange your hair. Did you use the comb I gave you yesterday?" "Yes, indeed," said Snow White, "and I fell into a swoon because of it. I am afraid there is something the matter with it." No, no, that cannot be, said the queen. There must be some mistake. But if you cannot use the comb, I will let you have this pretty ribbon instead. And she held out the poisoned ribbon. Snow White took it, and after the old woman, as she thought she was, had gone away, Snow White went to the mirror and tied up her hair with the piece of ribbon. But scarcely had she done so when she fell to the ground lifeless and lay there as if she were dead. That evening the dwarfs came home and found Snow White lying on the ground as if dead, but soon discovered the poison ribbon and untied it, and almost as soon as this was done, Snow White revived again. Next morning, the queen went once more to the mirror on the wall and called out, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" To which the mirror replied without any change, "Queen, queen, on thy throne, Snow White's the fairest thou must own." And the queen recognized that once again her plans had failed, and Snow White was still alive. So she dressed herself once more and took with her a poisoned apple, which was so arranged that only one half of it was poisoned and the rest of it was left as before. And when the queen got to the hut of the dwarfs, she tried to open the door, but Snow White called out, "You can't come in." "Then I'll come to the window," said the queen. "Ah, you are the old lady that came twice before. You have not brought me good luck. Each time something has befallen me." But the queen said, "I do not know how that can be. I only brought you something for your hair. Perhaps you tied it too tight. To show you that I have no ill will against you, I have brought you this beautiful apple." "But my guardians," said Snow White, "told me that I must take nothing more from you." "Oh, this is nothing to wear," said the queen. "This is something to eat. To show you that there can be no harm in it, I will take half of it myself, and you shall eat the other half." So she cut the apple in two and gave the poisoned half to Snow White. And the moment she had swallowed the first bite of it, she fell down dead. Then the queen slunk away and went at once to her chamber and addressed the mirror on the wall. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And this time the mirror answered as it used to do, "Queen, queen, on thy throne, the greatest beauty is thine own." Then the queen knew that Snow White was dead at last, and that she was without a rival in beauty. When the dwarfs came home that night, they found Snow White lying upon the ground quite dead, and could not find out what had happened or how they could cure her. But though she seemed dead, Snow White kept her beautiful white skin and seemed more like a statue than a dead person. So the dwarfs had a glass coffer made and put Snow White in and locked it up. And she remained there for days and days without changing the slightest, looking oh so beautiful under the glass case. Now, a great prince of the neighboring country happened to be hunting near the hill of the dwarfs, and called at their hut to get a glass of water. And when he came in, he found nobody there but Snow White lying in her crystal coffer. And he fell at once in love with her, and sat by her side till the dwarfs came home, and he asked them who she was. Then they told him her history, and he begged that he might carry the coffer away so that he might always have her near him. At first they would not do so, but he showed how much he loved her, so that they at last yielded, and he called for his men to carry the coffer home to his palace. And when the men commenced carrying the coffer down the mountain, they jolted it so much that the piece of poisoned apple in Snow White's throat fell out, and she revived and opened her eyes and looked upon the prince who was riding by her side. Then he ordered the coffer to be opened and told her all that had happened, and he took her home to his castle. After this happened, the queen once more came to her room and spoke to the mirror on the wall and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" And the mirror this time said again, "Queen, queen, on thy throne, Snow White's the fairest thou must own." And the queen was so enraged because she had not destroyed Snow White that she ran to her window so she could scream at the top of her lungs, and she stumbled and fell out, landing on the ground, and died on the spot. Snow White and the prince were married, and they lived happily ever after. "The end," said Grandmother, as she looked down to the children and noticed that they were still wide awake. They enjoyed it so much that they wanted one more story. "Please, Grandma, tell us one more story," they pleaded. "All right then," said she. "This will be the last one, and then you take your nap." The children agreed and once again eagerly settled down for another story. This time I'm going to read you a lovely story called Rapunzel, which is about a beautiful girl with long hair and an evil witch. "An evil witch?" asked Peter. "Yes, that's right," said Grandma, as she turned the page of the storybook and began to read. There was once a man and a woman who had long in vain wished for a child. At length, the woman hoped that God was about to grant her desire. These people had a little window at the back of their house from which a splendid garden could be seen, which was full of the most beautiful flower and herbs. It was, however, surrounded by a high wall, and no one dared to go into it because it belonged to an enchantress who had great power and was dreaded by all the world. One day the woman was standing by this window and looking down into the garden when she saw a bed which was planted with the most beautiful rampion, also known as Rapunzel, and it looked so fresh and green that she longed for it and had the greatest desire to eat some. This desire increased every day, and she knew that she could not get any of it. She quite pined away and looked pale and miserable. Then her husband was alarmed and asked, "What aileth thee, dear wife?" "Ah," she replied, "if I can't get some of the rampion which is in the garden behind the house to eat, I shall die." The man who loved her thought, "Soon then let thy wife die. Bring her some of the rampion, let it cost thee what it will." In the twilight of the evening, he clambered down over the wall into the garden of the enchantress, hastily clutched a handful of rampion, and took it to his wife. She at once made a salad of it and ate it with much relish. She, however, liked it so much, so very much, that the next day she longed for it 3 times as much as before. If he was to have any rest, her husband must once more descend into the garden. In the gloom of the evening, therefore, he let himself down again. But when he had clambered down the wall, he was terribly afraid, for he saw the enchantress standing before him. "How canst thou dare," said she with angry look, "to descend into my garden and steal my rampion like a thief? Thou shalt suffer for it." "Ah," answered he, "let mercy take the place of justice. I only made up my mind to do it out of necessity. My wife saw your rampion from the window and felt such a longing for it that she would have died if she had not got some to eat." Then the enchantress allowed her anger to be softened and said to him, "If the case be as thou sayest, I will allow thee to take away with thee as much rampion as thou wilt. Only I make one condition. Thou must give me the child which thy wife will bring into the world. It shall be well treated, and I will care for it like a mother." The man, in his terror, consented to everything, and when the woman was brought to bed, the enchantress appeared at once, gave the child the name Rapunzel, and took it away with her. Rapunzel grew into the most beautiful child beneath the sun. When she was 12 years old, the enchantress shut her into a tower, which lay in a forest and had neither stairs nor door, but quite at the top was a little window. When the enchantress wanted to go in, she placed herself beneath it and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me." Rapunzel had magnificent long hair, fine as spun gold, and when she heard the voice of the enchantress, she unfastened her braided tresses, wound them round one of the hooks of the window above, and then the hair fell 20 ells down, and the enchantress climbed up by it. After a year or two, it came to pass that the king's son rode through the forest and went by the tower. Then he heard a song, which was so charming that he stood still and listened. This was Rapunzel, who in her solitude passed her time in letting her sweet voice resound. The king's son wanted to climb up to her and looked for the door of the tower, but none was to be found. He rode home, but the singing had so deeply touched his heart that every day he went out into the forest and listened to it. Once, when he was thus standing behind a tree, he saw that an enchantress came there, and he heard how she cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Then Rapunzel let down the braids of her hair, and the enchantress climbed up to her. "If that is the ladder by which one mounts, I will for once try my fortune," said he. And the next day, when it began to grow dark, he went to the tower and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Immediately the hair fell down and the king's son climbed up. At first, Rapunzel was terribly frightened when a man such as her eyes had never yet beheld came to her. But the king's son began to talk to her quite like a friend, and told her that his heart had been so stirred that it had let him have no rest, and he had been forced to see her. Then Rapunzel lost her fear, and when he asked her if she would take him for her husband, and she saw that he was young and handsome, she thought, "He will love me more than old Dame Gothel does," and she said yes, and laid her hand in his. She said, "I will willingly go away with thee, but I do not know how to get down. Bring with thee a skein of silk every time that thou comest, and I will weave a ladder with it, and when that is ready I will descend, and thou wilt take me on thy horse." They agreed that until that time he should come to her every evening, for the old woman came by day. The enchantress remarked nothing of this, until once Rapunzel said to her, "Tell me, Dame Gothel, how it happens that you are so much heavier for me to draw up than the young king's son. He is with me in a moment." "Ah, thou wicked child," cried the enchantress, "what do I hear thee say? I thought I had separated thee from all the world, and yet thou hast deceived me." In her anger, she clutched Rapunzel's beautiful tresses, wrapped them twice round her left hand, seized a pair of scissors with the right, and snip, snap, they were cut off, and the lovely braids lay on the ground. And she was so pitiless that she took poor Rapunzel into a desert where she had to live in great grief and misery. On the same day, however, that she cast out Rapunzel, the enchantress in the evening fastened the braids of hair which she had cut off to the hook of the window, and when the king's son came and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair," she let down the hair. The king's son ascended, but he did not find the dearest Rapunzel above, but the enchantress, who gazed at him with wicked and venomous looks. "Aha!" she cried mockingly. "Thou wouldst fetch thy dearest, but the beautiful bird sits no longer singing in the nest. The cat has got it, and will scratch out thy eyes as well. Rapunzel is lost to thee. Thou wilt never see her more." The king's son was beside himself with pain, and in his despair he leapt down from the tower. He escaped with his life, but the thorns into which he fell pierced his eyes. Then he wandered quite blind about the forest, ate nothing but roots and berries, and did nothing but lament and weep over the loss of his dearest wife. Thus he roamed about in misery for some years, and at length came to the desert where Rapunzel, with the twins, to which she had given birth, a boy and a girl, lived in wretchedness. He heard a voice, and it seemed so familiar to him that he went towards it, and when he approached, Rapunzel knew him and fell on his neck and wept. 2 of her tears wetted his eyes, and they grew clear again, and he could see with them as before. He led her to his kingdom where he was joyfully received, and they lived for a long time afterwards, happy and contented. Grandmother closed the storybook and said, "Well, children, it is nap time now." But she could see that the children were not ready to end this special moment. They were feeling very cozy sitting with their grandma by the fireside, listening to the stories on such a dull, rainy day. In fact, Grandma too felt delighted for being able to spend a quiet afternoon with her 2 little treasures. But we're not sleepy, said Judy, rubbing her eyes. We want one more story. Please, Grandma, she begged. Yes, one more, echoed her brother, stifling a yawn. Well, this is the very last story, warned Grandmother. Promise me that after this you will take your nap. Oh, yes, we will, they both promised, and once again cuddled up comfortably for the new story. What is this story going to be about, Grandma? Asked Judy. This story is of a princess who slept for 100 years. 100 years? Asked Peter. That is a very long time to sleep, isn't it, Grandma? Yes, it sure is, said Grandmother. Now, let's see what this story's about. And so the dear old lady began to read softly to the children the story of Sleeping Beauty. A long time ago, there was a king and queen who said every day, "Ah, if only we had a child." But they never had one. But it happened that once, when the queen was bathing, a frog crept out of the water onto the land and said to her, "Your wish shall be fulfilled. Before a year has gone by, you shall have a daughter." What the frog had said came true, and the queen had a little girl who was so pretty that the king could not contain himself for joy and ordered a great feast. He invited not only his kindred, friends, and acquaintance, but also the wise women, in order that they might be kind and well disposed towards the child. There were 13 of them in his kingdom, but as he only had 12 golden plates for them to eat out of, one of them had to be left at home. The feast was held with all manner of splendor, and when it came to an end, the wise women bestowed their magic gifts upon the baby. One gave virtue, another beauty, a third riches, and so on with everything in the world that one can wish for. When 11 of them had made their promises, suddenly the 13th came in. She wished to avenge herself for not having been invited, and without greeting or even looking at anyone, she cried out with a loud voice, "The king's daughter shall in her 15th year prick herself with a spindle and fall down dead." And without saying a word more, she turned around and left the room. They were all shocked, but the 12th, whose good wish still remained unspoken, came forward, and as she could not undo the evil sentence, but only soften it, she said, "It shall not be death, but a deep sleep of 100 years, into which the princess shall fall." The king, who would fain keep his dear child from this misfortune, gave orders that every spindle in the whole kingdom should be burnt. Meanwhile, the gifts of the wise women were plenteously fulfilled on the young girl, for she was beautiful, modest, good-natured, and wise, that everyone who saw her was bound to love her. It happened that on the very day when she was 15 years old, the king and queen were not at home, and the maiden was left in the palace quite alone. So she went round into all sorts of places, looked into rooms and bedchambers just as she liked, and at last came to an old tower. She climbed up the narrow winding staircase and reached a little door. A rusty key was in the lock, and when she turned it, the door sprang open, and there in a little room sat an old woman with a spindle, busily spinning her flax. "Good day, old dame," said the king's daughter. "What are you doing here?" "I am spinning," said the old woman, and nodded her head. "What sort of thing is that rattles round so merrily?" said the girl, and she took the spindle and wanted to spin too. But scarcely had she touched the spindle when the magic decree was fulfilled, and she pricked her finger with it. And in the very moment when she felt the prick, she fell down upon the bed that stood there and lay in a deep sleep. And this sleep extended over the whole palace. The king and queen, who had just come home and had entered the great hall, began to go to sleep, and the whole of the court with them. The horses, too, went to sleep in the stable, the dogs in the yard, the pigeons upon the roof, the flies on the wall. Even the fire that was flaming on the hearth became quiet and slept. The roast meat left off frizzling, and the cook, who was just going to pull the hair of the scullery boy because he had forgotten something, let him go and went to sleep. And the wind fell, and on the trees before the castle not a leaf moved again. But round about the castle there began to grow a hedge of thorns, which every year became higher, and at last grew close up round the castle and all over it, so that there was nothing of it to be seen, not even the flag upon the roof. But the story of the beautiful sleeping briar rose, for so the princess was named, went about the country, so that from time to time king's sons came and tried to get through the thorny hedge into the castle. But they found it impossible, for the thorns held fast together as if they had hands, and the youths were caught in them, could not get loose again. After long, long years, a king's son came again to the country, and heard an old man talking about the thorn hedge, and that a castle was said to stand behind it, in which a wonderfully beautiful princess named Briar Rose had been asleep for 100 years, and that the king and queen and the whole court were asleep likewise. He had heard, too, from his grandfather, that many king's sons had already come and had tried to get through the thorny hedge, but they had remained sticking fast in it and had died a pitiful death. Then the youth said, "I am not afraid. I will go and see the beautiful Briar Rose." The good old man might dissuade him as he would, he did not listen to his words. But by this time the 100 years had just passed, and the day had come when Briar Rose was to awake again. When the king's son came near the thorn hedge, it was nothing but large and beautiful flowers, which parted from each other of their own accord and let him pass unhurt. Then they closed again behind him like a hedge. In the castle yard he saw the horses and the spotted hounds lying asleep. On the roof sat the pigeons with their heads under their wings. And when he entered the house, the flies were asleep upon the wall. The cook in the kitchen was still holding out his hand to seize the boy, and the maid was sitting by the black hen which he was going to pluck. He went on farther, and in the great hall he saw the whole of the court lying asleep, and up by the throne lay the king and the queen. Then he went on still farther, and all was so quiet that a breath could be heard, and at last he came to the tower and opened the door into the little room where Briar Rose was sleeping. There she lay, so beautiful but he could not turn his eyes away, and he stooped down and gave her a kiss. But as soon as he kissed her, Briar Rose opened her eyes and awoke. But as soon as he kissed her, Briar Rose opened her eyes and awoke, and looked at him quite sweetly. Then they went down together, and the king awoke, and the queen, and the whole court, and looked at each other in great astonishment. And the horses in the courtyard stood up and shook themselves. The hounds jumped up and wagged their tails. The pigeons upon the roof pulled out their heads from under their wings, looked round, and flew into the open country. The flies on the wall crept again. The fire in the kitchen burned up and flickered and cooked the meat. The joint began to turn and frizzle again, and the cook gave the boy such a box on the ear that he screamed, and the maid plucked the fowl ready for the spit. And then the marriage of the king's son with Briar Rose was celebrated with all splendor, and they lived contented to the end of their days. Grandmother looked down to the children and saw that they were already fast asleep. In fact, they began to doze off just at the part when the entire castle fell into a deep, enchanted sleep. Grandma smiled as she saw her beautiful angels sleeping peacefully in the comforting, warm glow of the blazing fire. She closed the storybook and gently tucked them in with a soft, cozy blanket to keep them nice and warm. Then she gave each of the children a kiss on their cheek and quietly tiptoed out of the room. All the while, Judy and Peter slept soundly to the pitter-patter of the rain, warm and snuggly by the cozy, crackling fire.